Good morning to the members of the fellowship class and other members of First Baptist Church Mount Vernon and anyone else that's listening. This is the last lesson in this quarter's study of Proverbs and Song of Songs. This may be, and hopefully is, one of the last few online lessons, as we hope to be back meeting again in our regular classrooms on September 13th. However, I'm not sure. These online lessons may continue. That's up to the staff, and I don't know how to answer that right now, but this will be my last one for a few weeks. Our lesson today is in Song of Songs. Also, maybe you call it Song of Solomon. It's written by King Solomon. We're in chapter 5, verses 6 through 16. And the lesson today is called Relational Investment. That sounds like kind of a big word, big title. So basically, we should invest in our relationships. That's what I call this lesson. We should invest in the relationships that we have. Our lesson today is about God's directive about the marriage relationship, and as referenced and started out in Genesis 2:24. You've heard that verse. The husband and wife shall become one. We'll refer to that a couple of times in this lesson. Song of Songs is God's wise counsel regarding love and relational intimacy. So keep that in mind as we start on this lesson. Before we start, I think we should pray. And as this is being taped, we have a pretty severe, large hurricane heading for the Texas-Louisiana coast. So I want us to think about those people in the path of that. Now, by the time you see this, it will already be gone, but we're taping this a few days ahead. So if you would pray with me before we start the lesson. Father, thank you for giving us your word to study. Thank you for the blessings you give each of us all the time, every week. Thank you for our church and the leadership there. And we ask you to be with us today as we study this lesson. Help me to present it in a way that's pleasing to you. And be with those that are facing this hurricane. Be with those that are facing issues in our country. We have so much unrest right now. Just ask you to be with every situation. You have the answers. And it's pretty obvious that the human race does not have the answer. And we know you're in control, and we thank you for that. And that gives us comfort to get through each day and each week. All these things we ask in your Son's name. Amen. Okay. Now I'm going to be honest with you. Now stop a minute and think about what that says. We've heard people say that to us all the time. I bet everyone in here has had somebody come up sometime in their life and say, well, I'm going to be honest with you about this. I'm going to be honest with you about that. That sort of implies that you're not honest most of the time, but this time I'm going to be honest. In fact, I think about Judge Lanny Ramsey in his court all those years. I'll bet you that he has had some people in that court come up to him and say, Judge, I'm going to be honest with you this time. Well, I'm going to be honest with all of you folks and tell you that I am not very familiar with Song of Songs. I've known it was here. I always called it Song of Solomon. It's tucked in right after Proverbs, but there's another book right in between Proverbs and Song of Songs, and that's Ecclesiastes. Some of us are a little more familiar with that, but I have not really studied Song of Songs, but I would say that I was comforted by what Ridley Briggs said last week in his lesson, that he too had not studied a lot in Song of Songs, and that made me feel a little bit better. But here I am about to teach a lesson in Song of Songs. So I trust that you will be understanding with my presentation, and we'll learn together as we look at these focal verses, because I'm also thinking many of you have not studied Song of Songs a lot. It's a poem, it's poetry, it's a song, and it's written by Solomon. Also, as noted by Ridley last week, this book of the Bible can basically be described as Hebrew love poetry. The verses today focus on a wife writing to and about her husband. In Song of Songs, there are basically 5 voices. The first is the man, the husband, and that is Solomon. The second is the woman, the wife. In this case, she was a country maiden referred to as the Shulamite. The third voices we come across in here are of young women that the wife talks to. There's also a narrator, and there are some brothers. So those are basically the characters of this play, poem, poetry that Solomon writes. And what's a little bit unusual about this is that although written by Solomon, a man, today's verses tell what the wife is saying about him, but they're written by Solomon. Let's look at these verses, and you will see what Solomon writes in this poem about his relationship with his wife from her perspective. Let's look first at verses 6 through 8. I opened to my love, but my love had turned and gone away. My heart sank because he had left. Remember, this is the wife writing. I sought him, but did not find him. I called him, but he did not answer. The guards, your version may say the watchmen, who go about the city found me. They beat and wounded me. They took my cloak from me. The guardians of the walls, the people that were supposed to guard the city, did this to her while she was looking for her man. Young women of Israel, now she's talking to these women that are younger than her. Young women of Jerusalem, I charge you, if you find my love, tell him that I am lovesick. Now, I'm not the most qualified to teach a lesson about lovesick women. But there's some really good stuff here, and it applies to all of us. In verses 1 through 5, which aren't part of our focal verses, the woman describes her desires for the man, presumably Solomon. We pick up in verse 6 that we just read. When she opens the door for him to enter into her room, he's not there. Her need for companionship was not met. In verse 7, she goes out to look for him. The guards, the city watchmen, find her. They beat her. They assault her and possibly even sexually assault her. She, instead of cowering down and abandoning her mission, she immediately goes, after this has happened to her, she goes to the young women who are apparently around her or that she knows, and she sends out a missing persons report. She's not complaining about what happened to her. She's looking for her husband. She tells the young women of the city, if you find my love, tell him I am lovesick. I believe the Quarterly says that she calls him her love either 6 or 7 times in the Song of Solomon. Song of Songs, So she is totally committed to her husband. Now, what do we learn from these particular verses? Unmet needs and desires in a marriage can end in bad results and even tragedy. Part of a good, healthy marital relationship is being there for each other, both physically and emotionally. It makes a marriage stronger. Sometimes we don't think about that, and maybe this is written to the guys a little bit more. Be there. Be there for your wife. You don't have to do a lot sometimes, but just be there. There's a comfort there for her that she needs. A metaphor that Solomon may have used is the garden of marriage must be tended every day. Now let's look on the next verse by itself, verse 9. These are the young women responding to the maiden, to the wife. And verse 9 says, what makes the one you love better than another, most beautiful of women? What makes him better than another, that you would give us this charge to go find him? So they're asking her, why do you feel this way? They challenged her to remember why she was attracted to her husband in the first place? What makes this man so good? What initially attracted you to him? Why did you choose him over all of the others? Great questions. What do we observe from this conversation? The initial reasons we choose a spouse can be forgotten over time if we're not careful. Now, I will tell you, people change over time. I have heard some people say, well, that person has never changed. They're just the way they are, the way I remembered them 20 or 40 or 60 years ago. And that might be true of a very few people. But most people do change over time. Certainly we change physically. We also change because of things that we live, situations we experience in our life. Things that influence us have an effect on who we are and how we act. Adult responsibilities, children, health issues, financial issues, spiritual issues, all of those things work together to change us over time. And sometimes, because of that change, we forget what was so good about our marriage and our relationship when it started. Do you remember what made your spouse so good? Do you remember what initially attracted you to him or her? Why did you choose him over all the other, him or her over all the others? Don't lose your focus on your relationship. Unless there is a diligence to remember and guard all the reasons that led a person into marriage in the first place, the possibilities of the demise of the relationship only increase. By choosing to continually retell their story, a husband and wife can continue to build a successful and long-term marriage. Love must not be assumed, but continually developed and expressed. Excuse me. And one more thought on this. This is not really part of the lesson, but it occurred to me as I was studying this, and I'm certainly not a marriage counselor, and you wouldn't want me to be. But those of you who are contemplating marriage, and mostly this would fall into the younger category that may be listening to this, make sure you ask yourself those same 3 questions that the young women asked the wife here. What makes this person so good? What attracted him or her to you? What was the initial attraction? And why did you choose him over all of the others? Make sure you are in love with them, with the person, and not in love with being married because of peer pressure or societal expectations. Make sure you can see and believe in the characteristics that are described in these following 7 verses that we're about to read. I'm not going to comment a lot on these verses because they speak for themselves. Verses 10 through 16, there's 7 verses. This is, again, the wife speaking to and about, mostly about Solomon, the man she's married to. Let's look at these verses 10 through 16. My love is fit and strong, notable among 10,000. So she's talking about out of 10,000 men, he's the fittest and the strongest, the way I interpret that. Most fit and most strong, maybe, is the way to say that. His head is purest gold. His hair is wavy and black as a raven. Well, that lets me out. His eyes are like doves beside flowing streams, washed in milk and set like jewels. His cheeks are like beds of spice, mounds of perfume. His lips are lilies, dripping with flowing myrrh. His arms are rods of gold set with beryl. Beryl is a precious metal. I had to look that one up. His body is an ivory panel covered with lapis lazuli. I had to look that one up, and that's another precious metal. His legs are alabaster pillars set on pedestals of pure gold. Well, she's going on and on here. His presence is like Lebanon, as majestic as the cedars. His mouth is sweetness. He is absolutely desirable. This is my love, and this is my friend, young women of Jerusalem. She said, ladies, you young women, this is what I feel about my man. Now, I'm kind of sitting here. Well, I was kind of blown away by all this descriptive language and really passionate language. And I thought, guys, has your wife ever described you in such a way? Well, I don't know. Maybe your wife has. I have a wonderful, loving wife, but I don't think I've ever heard that language from her. But there is a point to be made here. That is, she is completely passionate about her relationship with her husband. And all of this applies exactly the other way too. The man should be completely passionate with the love of his wife. So keep that in mind. Love between a husband and wife will and should take on the following forms of encouragement: physical attributes and sexual intimacy. Friendship. There will be seasons, and listen to this, there will be seasons when the physical dimension of a marriage will be less important than the friendship dimension of a marriage. As we move through time in our relationships with our spouses, we should become, probably could become, and probably will become, hopefully, better friends than some of the things that we started out with, which might have been physical intimacy. So keep that in mind. I hear my dog barking upstairs, so you may hear that on the presentation. I don't think she's listening to this, but she is reacting to it maybe. So friendship. There will be, I covered physical attributes, friendships, emotional and spiritual depth, as demonstrated by the wife's description of her husband. So we have that very passionate, detailed description of her love. Okay, what is it that we take from this? Let me summarize here. We go back to the start in Genesis 2:24. Therefore a man shall leave his father and mother and hold fast to his wife, and they shall become one flesh. We also see that same verse quoted in Matthew 19:5, written 1,000 years later than Genesis, or over 1,000 years later. Song of Songs is a precursor to the kind of marriage Paul described in Ephesians 5:22 through 33. And this same verse is quoted again inside those verses of 5:31 of Ephesians. Intentionally and consistently celebrating each other in marriage is critical to a successful marriage, just like the passion we see with the wife in today's verses. Neglected marriages are rarely successful marriages. One-dimensional relationships seldom survive. If a relationship is based on the physical and sexual alone, then the emotional support needed for a marriage may be absent. If a marriage is just about friendship, to the neglect of sexual intimacy, a marriage may be passionless. Successful marriages are multidimensional: emotional, mental, and physical. This lesson speaks of the marital relationship and gives many practical and spiritual pointers. A married couple must invest in their relationship. But there are also many parallels, and this is very important as we wrap this lesson up. There are many parallels to our relationship with God in these verses. As you have heard and is stated in God's Word, the church is the bride of Christ. Now, you also, some of you may say, well, I'm not married. Good lesson. I'm glad to know all this, but it doesn't really apply to me right now. I think it does if you put it in the perspective of our relationship with the Lord and with Jesus Christ. The Song of Songs reminds us that the foundation of all pure human love is the greatest, deepest love of all. The love of God, who gave His Son to redeem sinners, and the love of the Son of God, who suffered and died for His bride, the church. So, based on applying that parallel, this lesson applies to all Christians, and we always need to remember, we need to be passionate about our relationship and invest in our relationship. Now, this concludes this quarter's study of Proverbs and Song of Songs. We start next week with a quarterly study of Isaiah, And soon, as I said earlier, we hope to be back in the class together. So I look forward to seeing as many of you as possible, and God bless.